It seems that the Drukhari have attracted the ire of the rebalancing gods. Games Workshop have just issued an FAQ containing several nerfs. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're taking a look at the new Drukhari FAQ, containing 4 different ways that Drukhari have been toned down a little bit. To be honest, I'm not too surprised that Drukhari have taken a few balance hits. Since they've come out, they've been putting a very hefty showing in at tournaments, taking something like half the events that have been played since the book released, and perhaps their win ratio has been even more impressive. They've been winning something like 60 to 70% of games, which really wasn't too far off the Space Marine Iron Hand supplement when it came out back in 8th. Generally these days, Games Workshop don't tend to be in the habit of nerfing codexes straight after they've come out. Most FAQs tend to be for clarifying rules as opposed to changing balance, but it seems that they've chosen to make a special case for the Drukhari. So here we have the 4 nerfs to the Drukhari faction. Basically a small nerf to the points costs of Raiders and Drazhar. The Dark Technomancers Coven trait no longer works on liquefier guns, and in an FAQ in the rare rules section of the main core book, they've also nerfed competitive edge. Now if you combine it with razor flails, you no longer can get attacks that both get doubled and then get doubled again. Games Workshop have updated a whole bunch of FAQs across a ton of factions, and I'll be certain to cover them in a new video, either tonight or early tomorrow. But it's interesting that they had no FAQ for the Warzone Charadon Book of Rust yet. It seems to be conspicuously absent amongst the rest of these. Either that means that they're completely happy with everything, or they just haven't got round to making an FAQ for that publication yet. First up, and perhaps one of the single biggest changes, is the nerf to Raiders. In the new codex, Raiders gained extra toughness, extra transport capacity, and a massive improvement to their Darklands, going to damage D3 plus 3, and to be honest, at around 85 points, they were one of the strongest units in the entire game of 40k. Pretty much a god tier transport, being really quite fast, and actually incredibly durable with that 5+ invul save. Sure, they might take a few extra chip wounds here and there from small arms fire, but having a 5+ invul against range made them really good against tanking anything like heavy anti-tank shooting. Things like las cannons just really weren't effective on them, and they were tougher than things like Space Marine Rhinos against that kind of fire, while still packing a pretty devastating anti-tank weapon. It meant that almost every single Drukhari list would spam at least 5 or 6 Raiders, something like that, and I think it was kind of expected that they might see attention at some point. They have gone up to 95 points, up from 85. For me, at 95 points, that just feels like a bit more of an appropriate points cost for them. I certainly don't think that they're nerfed to the point of uselessness, but they are considerably less good than they were before. I think that going up 10 points each though is going to be a general nerf to Drukhari as a whole. Most Drukhari lists were running something like 5 Raiders, like I said, so that's usually going to be 50 points less to play with if you are running with the same strategy. It might make people look a little bit harder at Venoms again now. In general, very few people tended to be running Venoms, they just didn't compare very well stats-wise to the Raiders and didn't really cost much less either. I still suspect that Raiders are going to be a little bit more competitive than Venoms, but now I think there might be a bit more of a decision between the two. Sometimes perhaps the Venom might be the better choice. The next nerf is Tudrazar. He's up to 145 points, up 10 points from 135. I've certainly talked about Drazhar a few times on the channel. Currently he's just an all-round melee monster. Provides great buffs to nearby incubi, giving them +1 to wound. Has the same ability to make enemies fight last, and also for Drukhari is really quite hard to take out. A 2+ save, 4+ invul, and -1 damage do him well. He's up 7%, going up to 145 now, which is a small nerf, but I think he still remains very playable. I think it takes him a little bit further out of auto-include territory, and maybe a few lists will choose to eschew him now in favour of things like more succubi or archons. Next up we come to a nerf to the Dark Technomancers. This one's the custom Homunculus Coven, the one that gives you +1 to wound and +1 damage on anything that you choose to overheat. This one I would say was being spammed far too much, to be honest. Mainly because the overheat mechanic was kind of quite punishing. It did outweigh the extra damage on most guns, but if you didn't roll to hit, you'd have absolutely zero chance of taking the overheat damage. So it meant that you could have entire detachments where you took loads of racks and grotesques with liquefier guns, and just drowned enemies under waves of damage 2 AP-1 shooting that all auto-hit. It was brutal against infantry, and it could even chew through vehicles fairly well. Games Workshop have perhaps just taken a very blunt approach to dealing with this one. They've just simply gone and said that Dark Technomancers no longer works on liquefier guns or twin liquefier guns whatsoever. Not so great for anyone who was chasing the flavour of the month and bought a whole load of racks with liquefier guns in the meantime. I'm not sure if this was necessarily the best approach to take with these. I feel like they could have done something a bit more subtle, maybe said that they only get the +1 to wound but don't get 2 damage on liquefire guns, or maybe just make it so it's working a bit more as intended, so even if you don't have to roll to hit, you still have to roll to overheat once per every time that you fire a liquefire gun. That could still have kept it usable and still quite good, but still have the chance of you actually destroying your own models, the same way that the obsession worked for everything else. Basically, I think that we're just going to see no dark Technomancers in Drukhari lists. Aside from liquefy guns, I just don't think that the buff is really worth it compared with other options, and it does kind of kill the way of playing Drukhari with spamming nothing but these guns. I certainly think it's okay that they've done something about this. Maybe they were just a tiny bit heavy-handed, and rather than making a broken option playable again, they've just made the incredibly strong option into something that's basically never going to get taken. Finally, for the Drukhari nerfs, we come to Competitive Edge. Competitive Edge is that witch warlord trait. It's the one that basically means whenever you attack an enemy unit, if you don't actually cause damage with that attack, then the succubus gets to reroll the same number of attacks starting from the hit roll. So say if you had a succubus with razor flails, she'd get 14 attacks, and she only got 3 wounds through, that means that she'd get a further 11 attacks. Now the way that they've nerfed this is because it had a silly interaction with those razor flails, because it sort of allowed her to double those attacks twice. She typically has 7 attacks base, that would go to 14 with the razor flails, and then she might get say 10 or 11 that don't make damage. Then, under the rules as they stood, you'd be able to use the razor flails to double the number of attacks from those initial attacks, potentially meaning that her second swing after Competitive Edge had taken effect will be something like 20 odd more attacks, more than she was even going to be swinging with in the first place. It made her easily the strongest combat character in the game for the points, particularly when combined with the Dark Lotus toxin, which would give all those razor flail attacks strength 4 and damage 2. Rather than address this directly in the Warzone Charadon FAQ that hasn't appeared yet, they've chosen to address this in a very specific FAQ in the Rare Rules section for the core book. They've now said that if you have attacks that generate further attacks like this, you can no longer use any abilities to gain more attacks from those new attacks. I guess maybe that's to make it watertight across the entire game, though I don't believe that there were any more examples of this as it stands. In any case, it is a nerf to Competitive Edge, though it still remains a great warlord trait. It still works just fine with razor flails and gets you tons of damage on the opponent, though maybe it might be paired with things like the Triptych Whip now instead. Between the warlord traits and relics combos, the Drukhari Succubus is still one of the very best melee characters in the game for the points, even if she's going to be quite easy to kill in return comparatively. So anyway, those are the changes to the Drukhari. Please let me know what you think down in the comments below. For me, I think that all of these seemed at least fairly justified. A good way of slightly toning down the faction without affecting the core of the army, and still leaving them very playable and strong. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly be covering all the other FAQs that just dropped, maybe in a big summary video of the lot of them. Hopefully should have that out either tonight or more likely tomorrow morning. Finally, if you have been watching a lot of my videos lately and you'd like to help keep them coming, I would just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page which you can find down in the video description. Making all this content does take a fair amount of time, and I wouldn't be able to take that time without the support of the generous patrons. There are a few advantages for backing the channel: seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.